The morning mist clung to the Allegheny River like a shroud as 22-year-old. George Washington urged his horse forward through the dense Pennsylvania wilderness. It was May 28, 1754, and the young Virginia militia officer had no idea that his next decision would plunge two continents into a 7-year war that would reshape the destiny of North America forever. Washington's small force of 150 colonial militiamen moved cautiously through the virgin forest, their footsteps muffled by centuries of fallen leaves. They were hunting French soldiers, specifically a diplomatic party led by Ensign Joseph Cowlin de Villiers de Jumonville. What happened next in that misty dawn would echo through history as the first shots of what Europeans would call the 7 Years' War, what Americans would remember as the French and Indian War. The conflict had been brewing for decades. By the mid-18th century, both France and Britain had established thriving colonies in North America, but their territorial ambitions were on a collision course. The French controlled a vast arc of territory from Quebec down through the Great Lakes region to Louisiana, connected by a chain of fur trading posts and military forts. Their strategy was brilliant in its simplicity: control the waterways, lie with Native American tribes, and maintain a light but effective presence across the continent's interior. The British colonies, meanwhile, were hemmed in along the Atlantic coast, but bursting with population and economic energy. Nearly 1.5 million British colonists lived in the 13 colonies by 1750, compared to fewer than 70,000 French settlers scattered across their much larger territory. The British colonists looked westward with hungry eyes, seeing endless opportunities for land speculation, farming, trade beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The Ohio River Valley became the flashpoint where these competing visions would clash. Both empires claimed this fertile region, and both recognized its strategic importance. Control of the Ohio Valley meant control of the gateway to the western continent. The French began constructing a series of forts to solidify their claim, including Fort Duquesne at the crucial confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, the site of present-day Pittsburgh. Virginia's Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie, representing British interests in his own land investments, was determined to challenge French expansion. He dispatched the young Washington on a diplomatic mission in late 1753 to demand French withdrawal from the Ohio Valley. The French politely but firmly refused, setting the stage for armed confrontation as Washington's force approached Jumonville Glen on that fateful May morning. Tension crackled through the forest air. The young officer had received intelligence about the French party's location from his Seneca ally, the half-king Tanaquerizin. What Washington believed to be a French scouting party preparing for attack, the French would later claim, was a peaceful diplomatic mission, similar to Washington's own earlier journey. The encounter lasted only 15 minutes, but its consequences would reverberate for generations. In the brief, confused skirmish, 10 French soldiers died, including Ensign Jumonville himself. Whether Jumonville was killed in the fighting or executed afterward, possibly by the half-king, remains one of history's disputed questions. What is certain is that Washington's first military action had killed a French diplomat and provided France with a casus belli that would justify a massive military response. The French reaction was swift and decisive. They branded Washington's action as the assassination of a diplomatic envoy, a violation of international law that demanded vengeance. Within weeks, a larger French force under Jumonville's half-brother, Louis Cowlin de Villiers, was marching toward Washington's hastily constructed Fort Necessity. The die was cast, and the fate of North America would be decided by the clash of empires. With colonial militiamen and Native American remnants, warriors caught in the crossfire of a conflict that would ultimately determine whether North America would speak French or English. The hastily built palisade of Fort Necessity squatted in the middle of a natural meadow, like a wooden island in a sea of grass. George Washington surveyed his crude fortification with growing unease as reports reached him of the approaching French force. It was July 3rd, 1754. And the young colonel was about to face his first real test of command, a test that would end in humiliating defeat and nearly destroy his military career before it began. Washington's force had swelled. two nearly 400 men, including reinforcements from South Carolina and a company of British regulars. But Fort Necessity was poorly positioned, surrounded by hills that provided excellent cover for attackers. The recent rains had turned the fort's interior into a muddy quagmire. When Louis Coulon de Villiers arrived with 600 French soldiers and 100 Native American allies, Washington's tactical disadvantages became immediately apparent. The battle raged for 9 hours in driving rain. The French, positioned on the surrounding ridges, poured deadly accurate fire into the exposed fort while remaining largely protected themselves. Washington's men, crouched in muddy trenches that filled with water, could barely return effective fire. By evening, with 30 men dead and 70 wounded, Washington was forced to accept the inevitable. The surrender terms, written in French and signed by candlelight, included an admission that Washington had assassinated Jumonville, confession that would later cause diplomatic embarrassment when translated into English. The defeat at Fort Necessity sent shockwaves through the British colonial establishment. Implications were clear. The French were not merely defending their territory, but were prepared to launch an aggressive campaign to drive British influence from the Ohio Valley entirely. In London, the Duke of Newcastle's government recognized that the American frontier crisis demanded a military response that went far beyond colonial militia capabilities. The British decision to dispatch regular army forces to North America marked a crucial escalation in the conflict. Major General Edward Braddock, a veteran officer with 45 years of service, was selected to command the expedition. Braddock embodied the professional British military establishment, methodical, disciplined, and supremely confident in the superiority of European military tactics over what he considered colonial amateurism and wilderness fighting. According to military historian Fred Anderson's comprehensive study, Crucible of War, Braddock's expedition represented the largest British military undertaking in North America to that point. The general arrived in Virginia in February 1755 with 2 regiments of regular infantry, the 44th and 48th Foot, each theoretically containing 700 men. These forces were to be supplemented by colonial levies and formed into a 4-pronged offensive against French positions throughout the frontier. The plan was ambitious. Braddock himself would lead the main force against Fort Duquesne, while other expeditions would target Crown Point on Lake Champlain, Fort Niagara, and the French positions in Nova Scotia. The coordination required for such a complex operation across hundreds of miles of wilderness proved beyond the capabilities of 18th century. Military logistics. Braddock's march toward Fort Duquesne became an epic of military folly. The general insisted on carving a proper military road through the Pennsylvania wilderness, wide enough for his artillery and supply wagons. The column, stretching for miles through the forest, moved at a glacial pace, sometimes covering only 2 miles per day. Washington, serving as a volunteer aide-de-camp, repeatedly urged Braddock to adopt more flexible tactics suitable for wilderness warfare. But the general dismissed such advice as colonial inexperience. The French garrison at Fort Duquesne, under Captain Claude-Pierre Picotti de Contrecoeur, watched Braddock's ponderous approach with growing concern. The fort's regular garrison numbered only a few hundred men, but Contrecoeur had cultivated strong alliances with local Native American tribes, including the Delaware, Shawnee, and Seneca warriors, who had grown increasingly hostile to British encroachment on their lands. On July 9th, within 10 miles of Fort Duquesne, the French launched a desperate preemptive strike. Captain Daniel Léonard de Beaujeu led a mixed force of French regulars, Canadian militia, and Native American warriors in a daring ambush that would shatter British confidence and demonstrate the deadly effectiveness of frontier warfare tactics. The Battle of the Monongahela became a catastrophic defeat for British arms. Braddock's soldiers, trained for European battlefield conditions, found themselves helpless against an enemy that struck from concealment and melted back into the forest. The British regulars, dressed in bright red uniforms and formed in neat ranks, presented perfect targets for hidden marksmen. Within hours, the expedition was routed, Braddock was mortally wounded, and the survivors fled in panic back toward Virginia. The defeat sent tremors throughout the British colonies and established French dominance in the Ohio Valley that would persist for years. More ominously, it demonstrated to Native American tribes throughout the region that the British were not invincible, encouraging many to join the French alliance in hopes of halting colonial expansion into their ancestral lands. The autumn of 1755 brought a chill that penetrated far deeper than the changing season. In the rolling farmlands of Nova Scotia, Acadian families who had lived peacefully under British rule for over 40 years suddenly found themselves branded as enemies of the Crown. The decision to expel the Acadians' French-speaking Catholics, whose ancestors had settled the region in the early 17th century, represented one of the most controversial and tragic episodes of the entire French and Indian War. Lieutenant Colonel John Winslow stood in the church at Grand Prix, reading the fateful proclamation to the assembled Acadian men and boys. His words, delivered in English to a French-speaking congregation, condemned an entire people to exile. Your lands and tenements, cattle of all kinds and livestock of all sorts are forfeited to the Crown with all other of your effects, saving your money and household goods, and you yourselves to be removed from this province. The Great Expulsion, as it would be remembered, displaced over 11,000 Acadians from their ancestral homes. Families were separated, communities destroyed, and a peaceful farming population scattered across the American colonies and beyond. The British authorities, led by Governor Charles Lawrence, justified the deportation as a military necessity, claiming that the Acadians' refusal to take an unconditional oath of allegiance made them a security threat in wartime. The Acadian expulsion reflected the war's transformation from a frontier skirmish into a global conflict that would reshape the political map of North America. What had begun as a dispute over the Ohio Valley had expanded into a comprehensive struggle for continental dominance. The French and British were now engaged in what amounted to total war, with civilian populations becoming targets and entire regions facing depopulation. Meanwhile, the military situation continued to favor the French and their Native American allies. The string of British defeats had convinced many tribes that the French offered better prospects for protecting their lands from colonial encroachment. The Shawnee, Delaware, and other Ohio Valley tribes launched devastating raids against Pennsylvania and Virginia frontier settlements, creating a reign of terror that extended hundreds of miles from the main theaters of war. The British response to these frontier raids revealed the growing desperation of colonial authorities. Scalp bounties were offered for Native American warriors, and militia companies were organized to pursue raiders deep into the wilderness. The conflict was assuming characteristics of a race war, with atrocities committed by both sides and civilian populations bearing the brunt of the violence. General William Shirley, who had assumed command of British forces in North America after Braddock's death, struggled to coordinate an effective response to French advantages. The British faced fundamental challenges that went beyond military tactics. They lacked the extensive Native American alliances that gave the French such mobility and intelligence advantages. And their colonial militias were poorly trained and equipped for wilderness warfare. The French, under the capable leadership of Governor-General Pierre de Rigaud de Vaudreuil and military commander Baron Dieskau, exploited these British weaknesses with devastating effectiveness. French strategy emphasized mobility, surprise, and the use of Native American allies to terrorize British frontier settlements while avoiding major pitched battles where British numerical superiority might prove decisive. The war's expansion beyond North America added another dimension to the conflict. Europe, the 7 Years' War had erupted with Frederick the Great's invasion of Saxony, creating a global struggle that pitted Britain and Prussia against France, Austria, and Russia. The North American theater, while crucial to British and French colonial ambitions, was now just one front in a worldwide war that stretched from the Caribbean to India. British naval superiority, which would ultimately prove decisive, was not yet fully effective in the conflict's early years. French supply lines to North America remained largely intact, allowing reinforcements and supplies to reach New France throughout 1755 and 1756. The French Navy, while smaller than Britain's, was still capable of protecting convoys and challenging British control of the North Atlantic. The diplomatic situation also favored the French in these early years. Most Native American tribes viewed the British colonists as the greater threat to their way of life. Having witnessed decades of territorial expansion and settlement, the French, with their emphasis on trade rather than settlement, seemed to offer a more compatible relationship with Native American interests. As 1755 drew to a close, the strategic situation appeared increasingly favorable to French interests. They controlled the Ohio Valley, had eliminated the Acadian population from Nova Scotia, and had demonstrated their ability to defeat British regular forces in wilderness conditions. The British colonies, meanwhile, were reeling from military defeats and frontier raids, with their confidence in British military superiority badly shaken. The war that had begun with a young George Washington's encounter in a Pennsylvania forest was evolving into something far more complex and consequential than anyone had initially imagined. The fate of North America hung in the balance, and the early advantages clearly lay with the French and their Native American allies. The year 1756 brought both triumph and tragedy to the French cause in North America. Fort Oswego, the crucial British trading post on Lake Ontario, fell to a brilliant French assault led by the Marquis de Montcalm, the newly arrived military commander who would become the most celebrated French general of the war. The victory demonstrated French tactical superiority and seemed to confirm their dominance in the northern theater of operations. Louis-Joseph de Montmorency, Marquis de Montcalm, arrived in New France with a reputation as one of Europe's most skilled military commanders. A veteran of European wars, Montcalm brought professional military expertise that the French colonial forces had previously lacked. His capture of Fort Oswego in August 1756 was a masterpiece of siege warfare, executed with precision and speed that caught the British completely off guard. The assault on Fort Oswego revealed the growing sophistication of French military operations in North America. Montcalm's forces, numbering over 3,000 men, included not only French regulars and Canadian militia, but also hundreds of Native American warriors from various tribes. The siege demonstrated how effectively the French had integrated different military traditions, European siege techniques, Canadian wilderness skills, and Native American tactical knowledge into a formidable combined arms approach. The British garrison at Fort Oswego, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel James Mercer, was overwhelmed by the speed and intensity of the French attack. The fort's artillery was quickly silenced by superior French gunnery, and the wooden palisades proved inadequate against professional siege techniques. Within days, the British were forced to surrender, losing not only a strategic position but also valuable supplies and artillery that would strengthen French capabilities. The victory at Fort Oswego had profound psychological impact throughout the frontier. Native American tribes that had remained neutral or wavered in their allegiances increasingly saw the French as the dominant power in the region. The defeat reinforced British colonial fears about their military inadequacy and raised serious questions about the competence of British leadership in North America. However, the French success contained the seeds of future problems. The alliance with Native American tribes, while militarily effective, proved difficult to control and coordinate. Different tribes had different objectives and fighting styles, and maintaining their loyalty required constant attention and resources. The French found themselves caught between the demands of their Native American allies and the diplomatic necessities of maintaining a civilized appearance in their conflict with the British. The most notorious example of these tensions occurred the following year at Fort William Henry in August 1757. Montcalm achieved another brilliant victory, forcing the surrender of this important British fortress on Lake George. The siege itself was a model of military professionalism, with Montcalm offering honorable terms of surrender to the British garrison commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George Monro. The surrender agreement provided for the safe evacuation of the SEO, British garrison, and colonial militia, with the understanding that they would not fight again for 18 months. However, Montcalm's Native American allies, who had participated in the siege expecting the traditional rewards of war including prisoners and plunder, were outraged by the terms that denied them these spoils. The result was the infamous massacre at Fort William Henry, where hundreds of British soldiers and civilians were killed or captured by Native American warriors despite Montcalm's attempts to honor the surrender terms. The event shocked both European and colonial sensibilities and provided British propaganda with a powerful tool for demonizing French. Military methods. The massacre had far-reaching consequences for French strategy. While military victories like Fort William Henry demonstrated French tactical superiority, the associated atrocities undermined French claims to civilized warfare and strengthened British resolve to continue the conflict. The incident also revealed the fundamental contradictions in French strategy. They needed Native American allies to compete with British numerical superiority. But they could not always control their allies' behavior. Meanwhile, significant changes were occurring in British leadership that would ultimately transform the war's trajectory. William Pitt, the Elder, appointed as Secretary of State in 1757, brought a new strategic vision to the British war effort. Pitt understood that the North American theater was crucial to British imperial ambitions and was willing to commit unprecedented resources to achieving victory. Pitt's strategy represented a fundamental shift in British priorities. Previous British governments had treated the North American conflict as a secondary theater, subordinate to European concerns. Pitt recognized that control of North America was essential to British commercial and imperial interests, and was prepared to fight what amounted to a total war to achieve this objective. The new British approach emphasized several key elements: massive financial commitments to support colonial military efforts, the deployment of significant regular army forces to North America, and the coordination of military operations with naval power to disrupt French supply lines. Pitt also recognized the importance of improving relations with Native American tribes and began efforts to counter French influence among the indigenous population. The transformation of British strategy coincided with important changes in colonial attitudes toward the war. The early defeats in frontier raids had initially demoralized colonial populations, but they had also demonstrated the necessity of unified resistance to French expansion. Colonial assemblies began to provide more substantial military support, and colonial officers gained valuable experience in wilderness warfare. As 1757 ended, strategic balance was beginning to shift, though the full implications would not become apparent for another year. The French retained their tactical advantages and continued to dominate the northern theater, but British resources were beginning to make themselves felt in ways that would ultimately prove decisive. The year 1758 marked the beginning of what historians would later call Pitt's War, a massive escalation of the British war effort that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in North America. William Pitt the Elder, now firmly in control of British war policy, launched an ambitious three-pronged offensive designed to break French power once and for all. The plan called for simultaneous attacks on Louisbourg, Fort Duquesne, and Fort Carillon, with the ultimate goal of capturing Quebec itself. The Siege of Louisbourg, beginning in June 1758, demonstrated the new scale of British military commitment. General Geoffrey Amherst commanded a force of over 14,000 regular troops and colonial militia, supported by a massive naval squadron under Admiral Edward Boscawen. The fortress city, known as the Gibraltar of the North, represented the key to French naval power in North America and control of the vital St. Lawrence River approach to Quebec. The defenders of Louisbourg, commanded by Governor Augustin de Drucker, put up fierce resistance, despite being outnumbered nearly 3-1. The fortress's thick stone walls and strategic position had made it seemingly impregnable, but the British brought unprecedented firepower to bear. Dozens of heavy cannons pounded the fortifications while the Royal Navy blockaded the harbor, cutting off any hope of French reinforcement or supply. The siege lasted 7 weeks, with both sides displaying remarkable courage and determination. French resistance was particularly heroic, with civilian inhabitants of the city enduring constant bombardment while contributing to the defense effort. The garrison's eventual surrender on July 26, 1758, represented not just a military victory but a symbolic triumph that demonstrated British capability to overcome France's strongest positions. Simultaneously, the British offensive in the Ohio Valley finally achieved the objective that had eluded them since the war's beginning. General John Forbes, learning from Braddock's mistakes, adopted a more flexible approach to wilderness warfare. Instead of following Braddock's route, Forbes cut a new road through southern Pennsylvania, moving methodically but steadily toward Fort Duquesne. The Forbes expedition benefited from significant improvements in British colonial military organization. The general insisted on proper training for his forces in wilderness fighting techniques, and he made serious efforts to secure Native American allies to counter French advantages. The expedition also demonstrated improved logistics and supply management. Avoiding the disasters that had plagued earlier British efforts, the French position at Fort Duquesne, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly precarious. The garrison, commanded by Francois-Marie Le Marchand de Lignery, found itself isolated as British naval power began to strangle French supply lines. More critically, many of the Native American allies who had previously supported the French were beginning to reconsider their allegiances as British success became more apparent. The Delaware tribe, in particular, had grown disillusioned with their French alliance. The Treaty of Easton in October 1758 saw several important tribes abandon the French cause in exchange for British guarantees about their territorial rights. This diplomatic revolution deprived the French of their crucial intelligence and raiding capabilities, leaving Fort Duquesne vulnerable to British attack. When Forbes finally approached Fort Duquesne in November 1758, he found the position abandoned. The French garrison, recognizing their hopeless situation, had destroyed the fort and retreated northward toward the Great Lakes. Forbes immediately began construction of a new British fortress on the site, naming it Fort Pitt in honor of the minister whose policies had made the victory possible. The third prong of the British offensive, directed against Fort Carillon on Lake Champlain, initially met with disaster. General James Abercrombie, commanding the largest British force yet assembled in North America, 15,000 men, launched a frontal assault against Montcalm's carefully prepared defenses. The attack on July 8, 1758, resulted in a catastrophic British defeat, with nearly 2,000 casualties in a single day. The Battle of Carillon, later known as Ticonderoga, demonstrated that French tactical superiority had not disappeared despite British numerical advantages. Montcalm's defensive preparations, including elaborate abatis-sharpened wooden stakes and carefully positioned artillery, turned the British assault into a bloody repulse. The defeat temporarily restored French confidence and showed that the war was far from over. However, the broader strategic picture was increasingly favorable to British interests. The capture of Louisbourg had opened the St. Lawrence River to British naval forces, while the occupation of the Ohio Valley had eliminated French influence in that crucial region. More importantly, British financial and material superiority was beginning to tell as French supply lines from Europe became increasingly precarious. The French position was further weakened by growing tensions between the colonial administration and the military command. Governor-General Vaudreuil and General Montcalm disagreed fundamentally about strategy, with Vaudreuil favoring continued reliance on Native American allies and guerrilla warfare, while Montcalm preferred conventional European military methods. These disputes weakened French effectiveness and prevented the coordination necessary for successful defense. As 1758 drew to a close, the strategic initiative had clearly shifted to the British. Despite the setback at Carillon, the British had achieved major victories that put them in position to threaten the heart of New France. The capture of Louisbourg in particular demonstrated British capability to overcome France's strongest fortifications and had opened the way for the ultimate prize, the conquest of Quebec itself. The morning of September 13th, 59 dawned clear and cool over the ancient rock citadel of Quebec. General James Wolfe, a 32-year-old British commander who had spent the summer in increasingly desperate attempts to capture the capital of New France, stood on the Plains of Abraham just outside the city walls, finally achieving the confrontation he had sought for months. The battle that followed would last less than an hour, but its consequences would echo through centuries of North American history. Wolfe's Quebec campaign, begun with tremendous promise in June 1759, his force of over 8,000 regular troops, supported by a powerful naval squadron under Admiral Charles Saunders, represented the culmination of Pitt's strategy to strike at the heart of French power in North America. The St. Lawrence River approach, opened by the previous year's capture of Louisbourg, allowed the British to bring European-style military power directly to Quebec's doorstep. The city's defenses, however, proved formidable. Quebec's position on high bluffs overlooking the St. Lawrence River made it nearly impregnable to direct assault, while the extensive fortifications built over more than a century of French rule provided protection against artillery bombardment. The Marquis de Montcalm, commanding the French defense, had positioned his forces to take maximum advantage of these natural and artificial barriers. For 3 months, Wolfe had struggled to find a way to force a decisive battle. His initial attacks on the Beauport shore east of Quebec had been bloodily repulsed, while bombardment of the city itself had caused civilian casualties without significantly weakening the military position. The British generals, suffering from various ailments and growing increasingly frustrated, had begun to consider increasingly desperate measures. The solution came from an unexpected source: the discovery of a narrow path up the bluffs at Anse Fallon, later known as Wolfe's Cove. This treacherous route, lightly guarded because it was considered impassable for a large force, offered the possibility of landing troops directly on the Plains of Abraham, the flat ground immediately west of Quebec's walls. The operation would be extraordinarily risky, requiring a night river crossing followed by a difficult climb up a steep cliff face. On the night of September 12th, Wolfe's carefully selected force of 4,800 men embarked on what many considered a suicidal mission. The boats, carried by the river current, drifted silently past French sentries in the darkness. The advance party, led by Captain William Delaune, successfully overwhelmed the small French guard at the top of the path, allowing the main force to begin its ascent. By dawn, the impossible had been achieved. A full British army stood in battle. Formation on the Plains of Abraham, directly threatening Quebec's landward defenses, the French, caught completely off guard, found themselves facing the nightmare scenario they had spent months trying to avoid: a pitched battle on European terms against a superior British force. Montcalm's reaction revealed both his tactical brilliance and his strategic desperation. The French commander realized that time favored the British, who could expect reinforcements and supplies from their fleet while his own position would only weaken. Despite being outnumbered and caught by surprise, Montcalm chose to attack immediately, hoping to drive the British back into the river before they could consolidate their position. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham unfolded with the formal precision of European warfare. The French army, including regulars, Canadian militia, and Native American allies, advanced across the open ground in the face of disciplined British volleys. The British troops, trained in the deadly efficiency of 18th-century linear tactics, waited until the French were within close range before delivering devastating synchronized fire. The battle's outcome was decided in minutes. The French advance, already disrupted by British artillery and small arms fire, broke under the weight of coordinated volleys delivered at point-blank range. The retreat quickly became a rout, with French forces streaming back toward the city walls in complete disorder. Both commanding generals fell mortally wounded in the action. Wolfe, during the British advance, Montcalm, while attempting to rally his retreating troops. The death of both commanders added tragic drama to what was already a historically decisive encounter. Wolfe, achieving victory at the cost of his life, became an instant hero in British popular culture. His final words, reportedly delivered upon hearing of the French retreat, "Now, God be praised, we'll die in peace," captured the romantic imagination of a generation. Montcalm, dying with equal gallantry while defending his adopted country, earned similar posthumous honor from the French. The immediate consequences of the battle were obvious. Quebec surrendered to the British on September 18th, 1759. However, the broader implications took time to develop. The fall of Quebec did not immediately end French resistance in North America, but it marked the beginning of the end for New France as a political entity. The capture of Quebec was followed by a winter of hardship for the British garrison, cut off from supplies and reinforcements by the frozen St. Lawrence River. The occupying forces suffered severely from cold, disease, and inadequate provisions. The French, meanwhile, under Governor-General Vaudreuil and the Chevalier de Levis, Montcalm's successor, prepared for a spring offensive to recapture their lost capital. The Battle of Sang-Foy in April 1760 saw French forces under Levis defeat the British garrison outside Quebec's walls, reversing the previous year's result. However, the arrival of British naval reinforcements in May 1760 ended French hopes of recapturing the city. The Royal Navy's control of the St. Lawrence River ensured that Quebec would remain in British hands, while French forces found themselves increasingly isolated and outnumbered. The conquest of Quebec represented more than just a military victory. It symbolized the triumph of one vision of North American development over another. The British success ensured that the continent would be developed primarily by English-speaking settlers following British legal and political traditions, rather than by French colonists maintaining their distinct cultural identity. Chapter of the French and Indian War unfolded not in the forests of North America, but in the elegant salons of European diplomacy. By 1760, the military outcome in North America was no longer in doubt. Montreal, the last major French stronghold, surrendered to General Jeffrey Amherst on September 8, 1760, effectively ending French rule in Canada. Yet the war's ultimate consequences would be determined by the complex negotiations that produced the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The surrender of Montreal marked the end of systematic French resistance in North America, but it did not immediately end the global conflict. The 7 Years' War continued to rage across multiple continents, with Britain and Prussia facing France, Spain, and Austria in battles that stretched from the Caribbean to India. The North American theater, while crucial to the war's eventual outcome, was just one piece in a vast geopolitical puzzle that would take 3 more years to resolve. Governor-General Vaudreuil's surrender terms reflected the complex nature of the conflict that was ending. The agreement provided for the evacuation of French military forces while allowing French civilians to remain in their homes under British protection. The capitulation also guaranteed religious freedom for French Catholics and promised to respect existing property rights provisions that would prove crucial for the future development of Quebec under British rule. The transition from French to British authority in Canada revealed the war's profound impact on colonial society. The French colonial elite, including government officials, military officers, and many merchants, chose to return to France rather than live under British rule. This exodus created a leadership vacuum that would fundamentally alter the character of French-Canadian society for generations to come. The British military administration, led by General Amherst, faced the enormous challenge of governing a conquered population that spoke a different language, practiced a different religion, and followed different legal traditions. The immediate priority was maintaining order and preventing the kind of civilian resistance that had characterized other conquered territories. British policies during the occupation period would establish precedents that would influence Canadian development for centuries. The fate of Britain's Native American allies presented another complex challenge. Tribes that had supported the British cause expected to be rewarded with favorable treatment and protection of their territorial rights. However, colonial settlers, no longer restrained by the threat of French and Indian raids, began pushing westward into Native American lands with renewed vigor. The resulting tensions would soon explode into Pontiac's Rebellion, demonstrating that the end of the French and Indian War did not bring peace to the frontier. The global diplomatic negotiations that would determine the war's final outcome began. In earnest in 1762, the key players were no longer the colonial governors and military commanders who had shaped the conflict's early years, but European statesmen concerned with the broader balance of power. The Duke of Bedford, representing British interests, faced the challenging task of translating military victories into diplomatic gains that would serve long-term British imperial interests. France, despite its military defeats, retained significant negotiating leverage. The war had been enormously expensive for Britain, and there was considerable pressure in London to end the conflict quickly and reduce military spending. France also possessed valuable Caribbean islands and other colonial territories that Britain coveted, providing room for diplomatic horse trading that might preserve some French interests in North America. The Treaty of Paris, signed on February 10, 1763, formally ended the 7 Years' War and established the new political map of North America. The terms were more complex than simple British victory might have suggested. France ceded all of Canada to Britain, along with all French territories east of the Mississippi River, except New Orleans. However, France retained the valuable sugar islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique, which many French policymakers considered more economically important than the Canadian wilderness. Spain, which had entered the war as a French ally, also paid a significant price. The treaty transferred Florida to British control, while Spain received Louisiana from France as compensation for its losses. This complex reshuffling of territories reflected the European powers' view of colonial possessions as bargaining chips in the larger game of international politics. The treaty's provisions regarding Native American rights proved particularly problematic. While the document contained vague language about protecting indigenous interests, it provided no practical mechanisms for enforcing such protections. The British government's subsequent attempts to limit colonial expansion through measures like the Proclamation of 1763 would prove largely ineffective in the face of settler pressure and colonial resistance. The war's financial costs had profound implications for both Britain and its American colonies. The British national debt had nearly doubled during the conflict, reaching unprecedented levels that would require new sources of revenue to service. The British government's decision to seek this revenue through increased taxation of the American colonies would set in motion the chain of events leading to the American Revolution just over a decade later. For the American colonies, the French and Indian War had been a transformative experience. Colonial military officers had gained valuable experience in large-scale warfare, while colonial assemblies had learned to coordinate their efforts in support of common objectives. The removal of the French threat eliminated one of the primary reasons for colonial dependence on British military protection, creating conditions that would eventually make independence seem both possible and desirable. The war's end also marked the beginning of a new phase in Native American history. The elimination of French power removed the diplomatic balance that had allowed many tribes to play European powers against each other to preserve their independence. British dominance meant that Native Americans would now face a single, overwhelmingly powerful adversary with little interest in maintaining the careful diplomatic relationships that had characterized French colonial policy. The economic transformation of North America following the war was equally profound. The British victory opened vast new territories for colonial settlement and economic development, while the elimination of French competition allowed British merchants to dominate the lucrative fur trade. However, the war's enormous costs would soon lead to British attempts to extract revenue from the colonies, setting up the conflicts that would ultimately lead to American independence. The French and Indian War had begun with a young George Washington's encounter in a Pennsylvania forest and ended with the complete transformation of North American political geography. The conflict demonstrated that the fate of continents could be decided by the clash of empires, but it also revealed the power of colonial societies to shape their own destinies through military service and political organization. The war's legacy extended far beyond the immediate political changes. The experience of fighting alongside British regulars had given colonial officers and soldiers new confidence in their military capabilities, while the successful defense of their communities had strengthened colonial identity and self-reliance. The removal of the French threat had eliminated one of the primary justifications for British authority in North America, creating conditions that would soon make independence seem both possible and necessary. Perhaps most importantly, the French and Indian War had established the precedent that North American development would follow British rather than French patterns. The triumph of British arms ensured that the continent would be settled primarily by English-speaking colonists following British legal and political traditions, rather than by French colonists maintaining their distinct cultural identity. This decision, reached through 7 years of bitter warfare, would shape the development of North America. Centuries to come, the young militia colonel who had fired the first shots of the war in 1754 would, within 20 years, lead a revolution that would create an independent American nation. The military experience gained during the French and Indian War, the political lessons learned through colonial cooperation, and the confidence derived from victory over a European power would all contribute to the success of the American Revolution. In this sense, the French and Indian War was not just a conflict that changed the fate of North America. It was the crucible in which the American nation was forged. The peace that followed the Treaty of Paris proved to be merely an interlude. Between conflicts, the fundamental tensions between British imperial authority and colonial autonomy that had been temporarily obscured by the French threat would soon resurface with even greater intensity. The war that had begun with competing claims to the Ohio Valley would ultimately lead to the birth of the United States of America, demonstrating that the events of 1754 to 1763 had indeed changed the fate of North America in ways that none of the original participants could have imagined. Note: historical details and battle descriptions in this narrative are drawn from various sources including Fred Anderson's Crucible of War, The 7 Years' War, and the Fate of Empire in British North America, which provides comprehensive documentation of the conflict's military, political, and social dimensions.